If not for these architectural structures embodying ancient wisdom, millions of people would not have been able to survive the harsh winters and welcome the spring, yet, in the materially scarce Middle Ages, people managed to persevere by relying on survival skills passed down through generations. Imagine a world where winter is not merely a change of seasons but a deadly enemy. Snow up to one's waist, temperatures plummeting to extremes, with every minute outdoors posing the threat of frostbite. There was no central heating, no warm clothing sold in shops, and no electricity to power heaters. For millions in the Middle Ages, this was not a scene from a movie but the harsh reality they faced daily. Please watch the video to the end to understand how a simple solution in roof design could save an entire family from freezing to death, and how archaeological discoveries and experiments by historical reenactors have helped us unravel these ancient survival mysteries. Medieval survival was a true art where every choice, every detail mattered. It was an era where a person's life directly depended on their ancestors' wisdom, their own experience, and their ability to foresee danger. And among all decisions, none was more critical to a family's survival than the choice of location for their future home. This was not merely a building for shelter, it was a fortress against a harsh and unforgiving nature. A poorly located shelter could render all hard labour futile and push its inhabitants towards a cold death in the first winter. Therefore, selecting the site for a future hut was a complex science involving dozens of life or death factors. A south or southeast facing slope was considered ideal, a choice born of profound observation of natural laws. It maximised the use of precious winter sunlight, allowing its rays to warm the walls and penetrate the small windows, bringing heat and light indoors simultaneously. The slope itself acted as a natural barrier against the bitter north winds, winds that could penetrate the thinnest walls and steal away all precious warmth. The importance of wind protection cannot be overstated, for even the thickest walls were futile if biting winds could find cracks to enter and disperse the heat accumulated by the hearth. Meanwhile, people never built houses on hilltops or in deep valleys. Hilltops were exposed to winds from all directions, while valleys tended to accumulate cold air, and the even more deadly humidity. Dampness not only made life unbearable but also led to frequent illness in bodies already weakened by cold and malnutrition. Through generations of practice, it was found that the middle section of a slope, the so-called comfort zone, was optimal. Where warm air gently settled, moisture was less likely to accumulate, and natural forces were harnessed, not resisted. Proximity to a water source was another crucial factor. Streams, lakes, or springs had to be within easy reach, yet not too close, lest spring meltwater or heavy rains cause flooding that threatened the dwelling. Finding a stream not directly exposed to biting winds was a blessing, as such water was less likely to freeze solid in deep winter, providing a source of life even when everything else was icebound. Moreover, closeness to a forest was vital. Firewood was the sole source of heat, and every heavy log that had to be carried meant a drain on physical energy. Thus, huts were often built at the forest's edge, surrounded by dense woods that provided both fuel and building materials. The forest was not just a resource but a treasure trove. Experienced builders knew how to find the right fertile clay for daubing walls, thick, damp moss for chinking gaps, and birch bark and straw for waterproofing roofs. All these materials had to be gathered and prepared in abundance before the cold set in. Soil type was also a consideration. Clay soils, with good thermal retention and impermeability, were suitable for building sturdy, durable walls and formed the basis for later insulation features like heated sleeping platforms. Rocky soils, on the other hand, were cold, hard, and difficult to cultivate, making it nearly impossible to build directly upon them. In areas with hard soil, people often dug down to create semi-subterranean dwellings. Where soil was soft, they built lightweight wooden huts above ground. Could people without modern tools and scientific knowledge really consider so many factors? The answer lies in inheritance. This knowledge was passed down orally from generation to generation, from father to son, from mother to daughter. Studies of medieval village layouts reveal a thoughtful coexistence with the natural environment, proving our ancestors possessed remarkable intuition, observational skills, and attention to detail based on long-term survival practices. For them, choosing the right dwelling was not just about convenience. It was the science of familial continuity. After selecting the perfect location, people began building their hut. This was not just a shelter, but a precisely tuned survival machine. Its design, materials, and layout all served one core goal: to trap every bit of heat and keep the deadly cold outside. Every decision, from selecting logs to the thickness of the roof, embodied centuries of hard-won experience paid for by harsh winters. The hut's foundation lay in large, carefully chosen logs. Their diameter needed to be at least 40 centimetres so the walls could absorb the heat from the hearth by day and release it slowly at night, warming the sleeping inhabitants like a massive masonry stove. The logs were fitted together with astonishing, almost artisanal precision, using primitive but highly effective tools. This tight fit was crucial, as any gap could become a passage for cold air. Cracks between logs were thoroughly chinked, leaving no openings. Materials used included moss, clay, wood chips, and sometimes animal hair. This mixture, when dried, formed a dense, airtight mass that not only insulated but also resisted rodents and insects. Sometimes an additional layer of clay mixed with dung and straw was applied to the exterior walls. This coat, when dry, provided extra insulation and enhanced the house's moisture resistance. The hut's floor was usually a treated earthen surface. It was repeatedly tamped down, mixed with clay and gravel for density and levelling, and finally covered with a thick layer of straw or animal skins. But that wasn't enough. To further isolate ground chill, a shallow pit was sometimes dug beneath the floor and filled with dry leaves, moss or sawdust. This underground insulation layer effectively prevented cold from the deep earth from invading the living space. The roof, the most vulnerable yet crucial part of the house, was a survival masterpiece. It was built with a steep pitch so snow would slide off rather than accumulate, while a thin layer of snow was often left as it formed an insulating air layer. Roof thickness could reach 1/2 metre or more, composed of multiple layers, each with a purpose. First, a waterproof layer of birch bark, next, a main insulating layer of thick moss or hay, and the outermost layer of sod, thatch, or reeds. Sod roofs were particularly excellent, clinging tightly to the frame and even sprouting grass over time, turning the roof into a living, insulating grass blanket, an enduring ecological building wisdom in northern and eastern Europe. Such roofs were not only effective at insulation and waterproofing, but also remarkably durable. Windows were rare, typically replaced by small openings covered with oiled parchment or animal bladders. These windows were only on the south wall to capture the most sunlight. During severe cold, they were tightly sealed with heavy wooden shutters stuffed internally with hay or straw. Doors were designed with double layers, creating a buffer space, an enclosed porch or vestibule, between the inner and outer doors, functioning like an airlock in modern buildings to prevent cold air from rushing in with each entry or exit. Thresholds were deliberately made high to block cold air flowing close to the ground. The entire family lived in one room, with the hearth or stove as the heart and soul of the space. Sleeping areas were often on raised platforms, lofts, or a second level, as warm air naturally rose. Thus, even if the ground was cold, family members could sleep in relative warmth above. In the next chapter, we will explore an astonishing discovery: pit dwellings. Far from the crude temporary holes we might imagine, they were ingeniously designed subterranean dwellings whose sophistication even surprises modern researchers. We often mistakenly believe pit dwellings were primitive, uncomfortable temporary hideouts. However, archaeological findings and experiments by contemporary reenactors reveal a completely different picture. Pit dwellings represent the pinnacle of engineering wisdom for survival in extreme environments. They were not randomly dug holes, but complex, well-planned underground houses offering unparalleled protection against cold, wind, and even enemies. The most fundamental and irreplaceable advantage of a pit dwelling was its utilization of the Earth's stable temperature. At a depth of 2 meters below ground, soil temperature remains above freezing year-round, even during the harshest surface frosts. This meant maintaining a comfortable temperature inside. A pit dwelling required significantly less firewood than a surface house, a crucial survival advantage in an era where fuel gathering was exceptionally arduous. A pit dwelling didn't need to fight the cold invading from all sides, because it cleverly used a natural constant temperature thermal mass. Building a pit dwelling began with digging the pit, a labour-intensive task requiring the whole family's cooperation. Once shaped, the pit's walls and floor were reinforced with logs, planks or stones to prevent collapse and ensure long-term stability, especially important in damp environments. The ventilation system was the essence of pit dwelling design. A completely sealed space would lead to moisture accumulation and fatal carbon monoxide buildup, therefore. Builders created small ventilation openings near the top, allowing fresh air in while capable of being closed during blizzards. These openings also served as smoke outlets. The roof of a pit dwelling used a multi-layered structure similar to but more efficient than surface houses, a log frame covered with an insulating layer of moss and hay, topped with the thick soil removed from the pit. The soil, mixed with plant roots, formed a natural super-insulator, excellent at storing heat and effectively defending against rain. Such roofs were remarkably sturdy, even capable of supporting people and livestock, making the dwelling almost one with the earth, difficult to detect from outside, and offering excellent concealment. The hearth in a pit dwelling was often central, but its true ingenuity lay in the smoke exhaust system. Smoke wasn't expelled directly upward, but was slowly channeled through underground flues, made of stones or simply dug into the earth beneath the floor. Thus, as smoke exited, it transferred its residual heat to the overlying soil, which in turn radiated warmth to the entire living space's floor and walls. This was a primitive yet highly efficient underfloor heating system, maximizing every bit of heat from the fuel. The interior layout of a pit dwelling was also highly practical. Sleeping benches lined the walls, covered with hay and hides, while the central area was reserved for the hearth and daily activities. Archaeologists have found storage niches carved into pit dwelling walls, proving these were not temporary refuges but planned long-term homes. Compared to above-ground log houses, the concealment of pit dwellings was another major advantage. Roofs covered with soil and vegetation blended seamlessly with the surroundings, offering additional protection against enemies or wild animals. It was both a warm shelter and a hidden underground fortress. Archaeological excavations across Europe and Scandinavia have uncovered pit-dwelling village sites that existed for centuries, completely overturning old notions of their primitive temporariness. Experiments by reenactors have confirmed that a well-built pit dwelling can maintain comfortable indoor temperatures with only a small amount of firewood daily, making it an ideal solution for harsh winters. Whether in an above-ground hut or a subterranean dwelling, the hearth was the centre and soul of life. It was not just a heat source, but the family's heart, crucial for warmth, cooking, and the safety of all members. It was a multifunctional system without which survival was hard to imagine. The simplest hearth was a stone-lined fire pit on the ground, but the truly efficient and impactful masterpiece was a complex structure like the large Russian stove. This massive masonry stove, widespread in Eastern Europe and parts of Northern Europe, was the core technological feature of the home. Its large volume, built of clay and brick, could store enormous amounts of thermal energy, acting like a huge thermal mass. After a thorough firing, it could release warmth steadily and evenly for the next dozen or even 20+ hours. In an era where fuel and human labour were extremely precious, this was revolutionary efficiency. The design of such stoves was ingenious. Their internal flues were winding, forcing hot smoke to travel a long path before exiting, thereby transferring the maximum heat to the stove body itself. Chimneys were often built with bends to further increase heat exchange efficiency. It was, in essence, an ancient precursor to modern high-efficiency heating systems. The top of the stove often featured a broad brick-built platform called a sleeping platform or warm shelf, the warmest spot in the house, typically reserved for the elderly, children, or the sick. Its temperature could remain at a comfortable 20 to 30 degrees Celsius year-round, an oasis of life in winter. The stove's flue was also cleverly used for food. Preservation meat and fish hung near the flue would be smoked by the rising warm air, greatly extending their shelf life and providing valuable protein for the long winter. Mushrooms, berries, and herbs could also be dried nearby. Building a fire correctly required skill, starting with easily flammable kindling like small wood chips and birch bark, then gradually adding larger logs. Poor fire building resulted in a smoky room or incomplete combustion, wasting precious fuel. Fuel preparation began in summer. A family needed to store 15-20 cubic meters of firewood, split, stacked, and dried. Dry wood burned more completely and gave more heat. Regularly cleaning ash from the stove and flue was an essential chore, crucial not only for efficiency but also for fire prevention. Fires were the most dreaded disaster in medieval wooden villages. Medieval people did not always stay indoors. Hunters, merchants, shepherds, and travellers were often exposed to the elements, facing sudden snowstorms. The ability to quickly erect temporary shelters was then a matter of life and death. These shelters, seemingly crude, actually contained a deep understanding and clever use of natural laws. The simplest shelter utilised natural features like fallen logs, rocks, as support, building a frame with branches and covering it densely with spruce boughs, moss, or leaves. The interior ground was lined with dry moss or leaves to insulate against ground chill. Its main function was wind and snow protection. When materials allowed, building a simple lean-to with a sloping roof was more ideal. A frame of poles was covered with bark or hides, and a campfire was built on the leeward side. The lean-to provided shelter, the fire provided warmth, light, and deterred animals. In areas with deep snow, snow itself became an excellent building material. Experienced travellers knew how to cut compact snow blocks to build igloo-like domes or dig snow caves into drifts. Snow is a superb insulator. A small candle flame or the body's own heat could keep the interior of such snow shelters above freezing. If time and energy allowed, digging a small dugout was the most reliable choice. A shallow pit was dug, covered with branches and snow, and a small fire built inside the earth provided a more stable base temperature than air, and such shelters were well concealed. For hunting camps intended for several days, multiple shelters were often built around a central large campfire, forming a small community. The fire provided not only warmth and security, but also a centre for cooking, socialising and information exchange. Natural caves were sometimes used but required fires to drive out dampness. Whether permanent homes or temporary shelters, their walls were far from simple enclosures but a multi-layered, carefully designed defence against cold builders, using only local natural materials and generational experience, created astonishing insulation systems. In forested regions, large logs were the first choice. Straight, sturdy trunks of pine, fir, or oak were felled, finely worked with axes and other tools, and interlocked with mortise and tenon-style notches like dovetails. At key joints, moss, antibacterial, insect repellent, and expanding when wet to seal gaps, was stuffed. Where timber was scarce, stone became the main material. Stone houses were sturdy, durable, fireproof, and pest-resistant. But stone itself conducts heat quickly and stores it poorly, a cold material. To compensate, thick clay mortar was used, and exterior walls were coated with a thick layer of clay plaster mixed with chopped straw for reinforcement and dung for adhesion. This coat, when dry, became hard as stone, forming an effective insulating layer. Another common wall technique was rammed earth, or adobe. Soil rich in clay was mixed with straw and gravel, watered and repeatedly trampled into a uniform mud, then either poured into moulds and tamped down layer by layer, or formed into sun-dried bricks. Such earthen walls, when dry, were exceptionally strong and had excellent thermal inertia. Slow to heat up and cool down, balancing daily temperature swings, wall thickness directly related to insulation. In cold regions, walls could be over 1/2 metre thick. Moreover, interior space was often subdivided with partition walls to reduce air volume, improve heating efficiency, and block drafts. Interior walls were often coated with a thin layer of clay, sometimes mixed with lime to whiten it, increasing indoor brightness and providing moisture and insect resistance. In wealthier households, plank-lined interior walls and even painted or carved decorations occasionally appeared, symbols of wealth and status. Thus, medieval walls were a functional composite: structural support, windproofing, moisture resistance, insulation, thermal mass, and sometimes decoration. This was an engineering achievement reached through trial and error and knowledge transmission without the guidance of modern materials science. In an era where heat was exceptionally precious, a house's entrance was not a simple door, but a meticulously designed thermal defense line aimed at minimizing heat loss with each entry or exit. The most common and effective solution was a double-door system, creating a transitional space known as a vestibule or airlock. When someone entered or exited, the outer door was opened first to enter this unheated buffer zone, quickly closed, and then the inner door was opened to enter the warm interior. Cold air was trapped in the vestibule, unable to rush in directly. The principle is identical to modern air curtains or vestibules. The door leaves themselves, made of thick planks, were a thermal barrier. To enhance this effect, the inner side of doors was often lined with sheepskin, felt, or thick fabric. Gaps between door frames and leaves were carefully filled with hemp, moss, or rags. A long cloth bag filled with sand or straw was placed at the threshold, tightly sealing the gap under the door to block cold drafts flowing along the ground. For both insulation and defence, doorways were often made low and narrow, requiring people to stoop or even crouch to pass. Though inconvenient, this effectively reduced the opening area for heat escape. In simpler dwellings, the doorway might be covered only with a heavy animal hide or blanket. Less airtight than a door, but better than an open gap, locks were relatively simple but reliable, mostly wooden bolts, latches, or hasps. In later periods or wealthier households, metal key-operated locks appeared, with the keys themselves being status symbols. Every detail of the entrance design reflected a pursuit of survival efficiency under resource constraints. In medieval dwellings, the floor was far more than a walking surface. It was a crucial part of the building's overall insulation system. Cleverly designed and multifunctional for most commoners, a tamped earthen floor was the most economical choice. The ground inside the house was repeatedly beaten until extremely compact, then covered with a layer of mortar made from clay, animal dung, and chopped straw. This composite material, when dry, was hard, smooth, and somewhat water-resistant. Over this, a thick layer of fresh, frequently replaced straw, hay, or animal hides was spread. This provided a soft underfoot feel, and the still air trapped between the fibres served as an excellent insulating pad, effectively blocking cold from the earth below. A more refined approach was a wooden floor. Sturdy planks were laid over raised joists, sleepers, which rested directly on the compacted ground or stone footings. The space beneath the planks wasn't left empty but filled with dry leaves, moss, sawdust or sand. This fill was excellent insulation, forming a stable air pocket that prevented ground chill from rising, while also providing some damp proofing and insect resistance. This underfloor space was often used as natural storage, utilising the relatively constant temperature, cool in summer, less cold in winter, to store vegetables, root crops, grains, and even preserves, an ancient root cellar or refrigerator. In some spacious houses, the underground storage area could be large enough to stand in, accessed through a trapdoor in the floor. Thus, the medieval floor was a composite system combining load-bearing insulation, moisture resistance, and storage, showcasing the builder's wisdom in using natural materials to create a comfortable microenvironment. Maintaining air circulation in a sealed space was another serious challenge of medieval survival. Good ventilation was a matter of health, even life and death. It expelled toxic smoke from burning like carbon monoxide, human breath, and dampness that caused rot and disease. For nearly sealed pit dwellings, ventilation design was particularly critical. Small ventilation holes were typically placed high on walls and in the roof, utilising the principle of convection. Cold air entered from lower points, warm, moist, stale air exited from higher points. These holes could be temporarily plugged with wooden stoppers or grass wads, depending on wind and weather. In above-ground log houses, ventilation occurred mainly through two means: door openings and the stove's chimney. The rising hot smoke naturally created a draft, drawing stale air out. Fresh air entered through inevitable tiny gaps in the log walls, specially designed vents, or each time the door opened. In more advanced buildings, underground ventilation channels were even deliberately constructed, allowing outside air to be pre-warmed by passing through relatively warmer underground soil before entering, an ancient version of an air preheating system. Maintaining fresh air while retaining heat was an eternal contradiction. Medieval people, through practical experience, found various balances without ventilation. Even the warmest house became a breeding ground for illness. Excessive ventilation meant wasted fuel and lost warmth. Mastering this balancing act was also an essential survival skill. The roof was the house's first line of defence against wind and snow, and the most vulnerable part, therefore. Its reinforcement and ceiling were paramount during construction. The wooden roof structure, rafters, purlins, had to be strong enough to bear the weight of itself, the heavy coverings, and the immense load of winter snow. They were typically joined with complex mortise and tenon structures, not relying on the expensive and unreliable iron nails of the time. A massive ridge beam was often the core of the entire roof structure. The covering was a composite of multiple layers. On the rafters, a layer of waterproofing material like birch bark or planks was laid first, then covered with a thick insulating layer, moss, hay, and finally a weather-resistant top layer, sod, wooden shingles, reeds or straw. As mentioned, sod roofs were characteristic of Northern Europe, forming a living, continuously growing protective layer. The final step in roof construction was thorough chinking and sealing. Craftsmen carefully checked every joint and corner, stuffing them tightly with more moss, clay or wood chips to ensure no wind or rain could penetrate. This work was tedious but vital. Thus, we have completed our exploration of medieval folk shelter technology. We can see that huts, pit dwellings and temporary shelters were not randomly built crude structures, but thoughtfully conceived, highly complex survival machines. Every detail, every material served a clear function, together forming a complete system that helped humans endure in the harshest natural conditions. However, did you think that castles, symbols of power and wealth, were warmer and more comfortable than peasants' huts? The truth may be quite the opposite. Next, let us uncover the other side of castle life, a world of cold and discomfort beneath the grand facade. What if I told you that almost all your romantic imaginings of medieval castles and life within them are largely a beautiful misconception and illusion? Today, the castles we see in books and movies are often magnificent fairy tale palaces. But in the brutal historical reality, a medieval castle was first and foremost a formidable military machine built for war, and only secondarily a place for a family to live. From its very design, its primary function was to defend against enemies and survive sieges, not to create warm, comfortable living conditions for its numerous inhabitants. Every design element of a castle was subservient to military logic, making it an extremely uncomfortable residence in peacetime. The astonishing thickness of a castle's stone walls, up to 5 meters at the base of towers, was primarily intended to withstand impacts from trebuchets and battering rams, not for insulation. Stone is precisely a good conductor of heat, rapidly turning icy in winter and continuously radiating cold into the interior. The thicker the walls, for defense, the more pronounced their effect as a cold radiator, creating a paradox where military needs directly contradicted living comfort. Those narrow openings we romantically call arrow slits were designed for archery. They let in minimal light but allowed copious amounts of cold wind and drafts, making interiors dark and frigid. In an era when glass was extremely expensive and rare, before the 13th century, windows were often covered with oiled linen, parchment, or simply closed entirely with heavy wooden shutters. Glass was so precious that lords might dismantle and take it with them when moving castle interior layouts also followed defensive logic. The lord and his family's living quarters were usually located in the upper levels of towers, away from ground dampness but exposed to high-altitude winds. Narrow, winding staircases, advantageous for defence, acted like chimneys, creating strong vertical drafts that constantly sucked hard-earned warm air upwards. The great hall, with its high vaulted ceiling, saw heat from multiple fireplaces quickly rise to the roof, leaving people at ground level in a cold cellar. An absurd scene. Scorching heat under the roof, while bone-chilling cold at human height. Even the lord's private chambers were often just small spaces partitioned off from a corner of the hall with tapestries or tiny stone rooms directly against the cold outer walls. True warmth and privacy were luxuries there. The technology of the time simply could not effectively heat such massive stone structures. The modern concept of a warm home did not exist in the medieval mind. Cold was seen as an inevitable, insurmountable part of nature, like day and night, something to be endured. Castle architects were experts in fortifications, not heating engineers. Castle design itself presupposed that interiors would be extremely cold in winter, a reality everyone from garrison soldiers to dukes had to accept. Therefore, the core winter survival strategy in castles was not to heat the entire building, impossible, but to heat the human body, through heavy clothing, furs, and proximity to localized heat sources. The philosophy was, don't try to warm the air, warm the body. So, was there a carefully concealed medieval decorative secret that was actually a survival technique? Yes, tapestries. When we see those immense woven hangings covering castle walls, their primary function was not decoration but insulation. These heavy fabrics, hand-woven from wool and silk, were hung on sea.
In the center of the grand yet cold great hall, there was typically a large open hearth on the floor. This was the castle's true heart, the center of social life and cooking. The fire burned day and night, consuming vast quantities of wood. Smoke escaped through a dedicated smoke vent in the roof, but effectiveness depended on wind direction, often leaving the upper hall perpetually smoke-blackened and the air foul. People gathered around the hearth for activities, meals, and discussions. Proximity to the fire directly signaled social status. This heating method was highly inefficient, with most heat lost with the smoke, but it was the only means to gather people, provide light, and some warmth before the widespread adoption of wall fireplaces. So, how were the Lord's private chambers heated? The answer: braziers. These were metal or ceramic containers holding burning charcoal, portable heaters. They provided localized warmth for small rooms but required extreme caution against fire and carbon monoxide poisoning. Burning charcoal produced less smoke than wood, making it more suitable for indoor use. Ornately decorated braziers themselves were status symbols. Servants had to constantly replenish them with hot coals from the main hearth. Braziers were a compromise, creating islands of warmth in icy stone rooms. The ultimate personal heating solution was the bed itself. The Lord's bed was a massive wooden structure with four posts and a canopy, hung with heavy curtains, often firm Ines-lined. When drawn closed, the bed became a sealed room within a room, trapping body heat. The mattress was stuffed with down, layered with blankets and fur coverlets. Heated stones or metal bed warmers filled with hot coals were placed inside before sleep. Entire families or hosts and guests often shared a bed, due to space constraints and for shared body warmth. This bed was the final, most private fortress against the castle's chill. Besides external heating, medieval people knew how to generate heat from within. A high-calorie, high-fat diet was essential for survival. Thick stews, fatty meats, and heavy dark bread were fuel for maintaining energy. Boiling spices like pepper, ginger were used abundantly. Heated, spiced, and honey-day-lure wine was a common warming drink. Eating around the main hearth was itself a warming ritual combining heat replenishment, socializing, and psychological comfort. Finally, the human factor cannot be ignored. Medieval people were physiologically adapted to cold from childhood, with far greater cold tolerance than modern people raised in heated environments. Communal living was another key. People spent most of their time gathered in the Great Hall, with many bodies acting as heat sources. Constant physical activity, work, dancing helped maintain circulation. In winter, life contracted to a few heat-table rooms. Psychologically, cold was seen as a seasonal hardship to be endured, not an unacceptable disaster. The shared experience of enduring cold strengthened community bonds. Adaptability, collectivism, and correct psychological expectations were as important as tapestries and braziers. Medieval builders, without modern thermal science, possessed profound intuition and experience-based understanding of nature. Castles were often built on sunny southern slopes, with important rooms facing south to capture maximum sunlight, allowing stone walls to store heat by day. Northern sides housed storage rooms, staircases, and other auxiliary spaces as buffer zones. Inner courtyards could form sheltered, heat-strapping microclimates on sunny days. Furthermore, castle floors of stone flag or packed earth were covered with thick, frequently renewed layers of dry hay rushes. This served as a soft carpet, an effective floor insulator, and also absorbed dirt and improved hygiene, sometimes mixed with aromatic herbs. It was typical wisdom in using readily available natural resources to improve life. All the methods above were adaptations to the cold. True transformation began with the appearance and spread of wall fireplaces with chimneys in the late Middle Ages. Moving the hearth into the wall and channeling smoke directly outside revolutionized castle life. Indoor air became cleaner. Heating efficiency increased dramatically, and individual rooms could be effectively heated. This spurred the development of privacy, allowing lords to move from the public hall into warm, private suites. Castles began transitioning from collective fortresses to homes with private spaces. Building fireplaces was complex and expensive, and having multiple fireplaces became a new symbol of wealth. As fireplaces became common, many old methods of cold defense gradually lost their necessity, ushering in a new era of comfort. We can see that castle life was far from a fairy tale. It was a constant, creative struggle using every available means from layered clothing to tapestries, from braziers to curtained beds to fight the cold. Every element of daily life served the ultimate goal of survival. These methods showcase humanity's astonishing ingenuity and adaptability in the absence of modern technology. The history of castle heating is an evolution from collective survival around a communal hearth toward individual comfort in private spaces enabled by chimney technology. This history reminds us that the comfort we take for granted today is the result of millennia of accumulated human wisdom. Let's continue exploring the far-reaching impact and modern relevance of medieval heating technology. The widespread adoption of the fireplace was not just a technological revolution, but also a catalyst for social change. As fireplaces moved from the great hall into private rooms, the lives of noble families began to undergo a fundamental transformation. Family members now had warm spaces for solitude, reading, and confidential conversations, fostering the beginnings of individualism and a new value placed on privacy. Simultaneously, the fireplace became a new social center. Smaller, more intimate gatherings began to replace grand public feasts. This profoundly influenced architectural layouts. Castles and larger manor houses started to incorporate more rooms with specialized functions, such as private dining rooms, studies the solar, and bedchambers with their own hearths. This architectural shift mirrored a societal move towards compassionate listening and personal space. The pursuit of warmth also drove innovation in heating technology beyond the simple fireplace. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, we see the development of more sophisticated systems. One hypocaust s reimagined while the Roman hypocaust underfloor heating had largely been forgotten in Western Europe. Similar principles resurfaced in different forms. In some monasteries and grand houses in colder regions, channels for hot air or smoke were ingeniously rooted beneath stone floors or within walls of important rooms, like the abbot's quarters or the lady's chamber, creating early forms of radiant heating. The ceramic stoves catch LFN in German-speaking and Eastern European regions. The tile stove became a masterpiece of heating efficiency. These large, often beautifully decorated ceramic stoves had extensive, labyrinthine internal flues. The massive ceramic mass absorbed heat from a single, hot fire often lit from an adjacent service room and then radiated gentle, even warmth for many hours. They were vastly more efficient than open hearths and became central features of middle-class homes. Free refinement of the Russian stove. The large masonry stove evolved further, sometimes incorporating baking ovens, water-heating niches, and even connected sleeping platforms. The LEZ hanged into a single, multi-functional domestic unit. It remained the undisputed heart of the peasant home in Eastern Europe for centuries. The knowledge and techniques for surviving winter were not static. They were a form of vernacular engineering, constantly adapted to local materials and climates. The thatched roof of England, the log construction of Russia, the stone-and clay houses of the Alps, and the pit-dwellings of Scandinavia all represent brilliant, context-specific solutions to the same universal problem: conserving the precious resource of heat. Some lessons. Simple solutions of the medieval world offer profound lessons for our modern era, particularly in the context of sustainability and energy resilience. Passive house principles. The medieval builder's intuitive grasp of thermal mass, thick walls, large stoves, super-insulation, multi-layered roofs, moss-in king sod coverings, and passive solar gain south-facing orientation. Small windows are the very foundations of today's high-performance passive house standards. They understood that the best way to stay warm is to first prevent heat from escaping. The value of air-tightness and ventilation. The meticulous sealing of gaps and the creation of our locks vestibules show an early understanding of controlled airflow. Their struggle to balance warmth with fresh air prefigures our modern building science concerning ventilation and indoor air quality. Bioclimatic design. Medieval settlements were quintessential examples of bioclimatic architecture, designs that work with the local environment rather than against it, using the Earth's stable temperature pit-dwellings, leveraging prevailing winds and sunlight, and sourcing all materials locally created inherently sustainable structures. Resilience and adaptation. In an age before fossil fuels, survival depended on preparation, stockpiling wood, community cooperation, communal building and resource management, and adaptable knowledge, knowing how to build a shelter in a snowstorm. These are timeless principles of resilience. Conclusion: from survival to comfort. The journey from the communal hearth of the smoky great hall to the private fireplace of a warm chamber is more than a history of heating. It is a narrative of humanity's slow but determined march from mere survival towards comfort, privacy, and individuality. It shows how a fundamental physical need, warmth, shaped our buildings, our social structures, and our very conception of home. The medieval approach was holistic. Warmth was not provided by a single device, but by an integrated system: the location of the home, its orientation, its materials, its layout, the clothing of its inhabitants, their diet, and their social habits. In our search for technological solutions to energy challenges, we would do well to remember this systemic, humble, and deeply intelligent wisdom born of necessity. Their legacy is not just in the grand castles that dot the landscape, but in the timeless principles of shelter, efficiency, and living in harmony with a demanding climate.